There are moments in life when strength becomes a quiet thing. Not loud. Not proud. Moments when the world teaches you that power does not always rise, sometimes it bows. We grow up believing success is about standing taller, speaking louder, winning harder. But life has a way of undoing that belief. It humbles us through failure, through loss, through the slow realization that control is an illusion. And in that undoing, something unexpected begins, healing. This is a story about humility, not as weakness, but as lasting strength. A story about letting go of ego to find purpose. A journey where discipline softens into wisdom, and courage learns how to kneel. In a quiet monastery, far from applause and ambition, there lived a monk whose greatest lesson did not come from prayer, but from falling. The monastery rested on the edge of a mountain, where clouds often drifted low enough to touch the stone paths. Mornings there were quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if even sound had learned discipline. Bells rang softly before dawn, calling the monks to rise, to bow, to begin again. Among them was a monk named Tenzin. He had lived within those walls for many years, long enough to memorize the rhythm of silence. Long enough to be trusted. Tenzin moved with calm certainty, his robes always neat, his posture straight, his breath measured. When others struggled, he did not. When others doubted, he corrected them gently, but with confidence. The younger monks watched him closely. Some admired him. Some sought his approval. And though Tenzin rarely spoke of it, he felt their respect settle inside him like a warm flame. He told himself it was gratitude. He told himself it was responsibility. But beneath that calm surface lived something quieter, and heavier. Pride. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that boasts. The subtle kind that whispers, "I am further along than they are." Tenzin believed deeply in discipline. He believed enlightenment was earned through effort, restraint, and mastery over the self. Every prayer completed, every desire resisted, every mistake avoided felt like proof that he was becoming something higher, something purified. And what he wanted most was simple, though he never named it aloud. He wanted to be worthy. He wanted to be seen as wise. He wanted his journey to mean something. At night, when the monastery slept and the wind brushed against the prayer flags, Tenzin would sit alone in meditation. His mind was still. His body was steady. Yet somewhere deep within him, a question lingered, unasked but alive. If I were stripped of respect, would I still be at peace? He pushed the thought away. He had followed the path faithfully. He had done everything right. Surely humility was already his. But life, patient and precise, was quietly preparing to teach him the difference between appearing humble, and truly becoming so. As seasons passed, Tenzin's presence within the monastery grew heavier, not with noise, but with influence. He was asked to lead morning chants. To guide novice monks through their early doubts. To speak when questions arose that others hesitated to answer. And each time, he did so with grace. His words were calm. His guidance precise. When conflicts surfaced, his judgment was trusted. When routines faltered, his discipline restored order. The elders nodded in quiet approval, and the younger monks listened as if his voice carried something sacred. Tenzin told himself he was only serving. But inside, something began to bloom. It was subtle at first, a sense of certainty that followed him through the stone corridors. A quiet satisfaction when his advice was praised. A reassurance that his sacrifices had not been in vain. He had let go of comfort, ambition, and the outside world, and now the world inside these walls seemed to reward him. Success in the monastery did not look like wealth or applause. It looked like being needed. Being respected. Being right. Tenzin began to measure his journey through comparison. He noticed who struggled with discipline. Who repeated the same mistakes. Who fell behind in meditation. Without malice, without cruelty, he placed himself just a little higher in his own mind. I have worked harder, he thought. I have resisted more. I understand more deeply. And when pride rose, it disguised itself as responsibility. He corrected others quickly. He listened, but less. Silence, once a shared space of learning, became something he filled with instruction. His humility turned performative, visible, practiced, admired. At night, during meditation, his mind remained calm, but no longer light. His thoughts circled achievement instead of awareness. Progress instead of presence. Yet from the outside, Tenzin looked exactly as a monk should. Disciplined. Centered. Advanced. What he did not see was how success, when unexamined, can quietly replace purpose with identity. How the need to be strong can harden into the fear of appearing weak. High on the mountain, surrounded by stillness, Tenzin believed he was rising closer to truth. But the higher he climbed, the more fragile the ground beneath him became. The fall did not come loudly. It arrived without warning, without drama, just a moment that refused to be hidden. One morning, during a gathering meant to guide the novices, Tenzin spoke with his usual certainty. A question was raised about compassion, about whether discipline should ever bend for human weakness. Tenzin answered firmly, almost sharply, reminding them that the path was narrow, that mistakes were choices, not accidents. Silence followed. Not the peaceful kind. An elder monk, old and rarely outspoken, lifted his eyes. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. Discipline without humility, he said gently, becomes control. The words landed hard. Later that day, a deeper truth surfaced. A novice, struggling quietly for months, confessed that Tenzin's guidance had made him feel small, afraid to admit weakness, ashamed of failing. Others nodded. Not in accusation. In honesty. For the first time, Tenzin felt the room shift away from him. The elders spoke privately. No anger. No punishment. Only disappointment and concern. Tenzin was asked to step back from teaching, for reflection, they said. For balance. In that moment, everything he had built cracked. Respect faded into distance. The glances that once held admiration now held uncertainty. Conversations softened around him, as if people were afraid of saying the wrong thing. That night, alone in his cell, Tenzin tried to meditate. He couldn't. His breath felt heavy. His thoughts raced. Shame pressed against his chest like a weight he could not lift. He replayed every word he had spoken, every correction he had made. He told himself he meant well. That he was right. But beneath the justifications was fear. Who am I if I am no longer trusted? Who am I if I have failed? The fall was not the loss of status. It was the loss of certainty. For the first time since arriving at the monastery, Tenzin felt exposed, not to others, but to himself. The discipline that once steadied him now felt empty. The silence that once healed him now echoed. And in that echo, a truth began to surface, one he was not yet ready to face. Tenzin did not leave the monastery. He stayed, but something in him withdrew. Days passed with the same bells, the same prayers, the same stone paths. Yet everything felt different. Where silence once felt sacred, it now felt accusatory. Every bowed head reminded him of the one thing he had lost, his place. He told himself the elders were being cautious. That the novices were sensitive. That truth, when spoken clearly, often hurts before it heals. These thoughts comforted him, wrapping his wounded pride in reason. I was only doing my duty, he repeated. But duty without humility hardens quickly. Tenzin continued his practices with precision. He woke before dawn, sat longer in meditation, fasted more often. From the outside, it looked like devotion. From the inside, it was resistance. He avoided conversation. When others spoke, he listened only enough to respond defensively in his own mind. Apologies formed and dissolved before ever reaching his lips. To admit fault felt like erasing everything he had worked for. At night, memories returned uninvited. The elder's words. The novice's lowered eyes. The quiet disappointment that lingered in the air. Guilt settled into his chest, but he refused to name it. Instead, it turned into bitterness, toward those who misunderstood him, toward a path that now felt unfair. He began to cling to the past version of himself, the respected teacher, the disciplined example, the monk who knew. Letting go of that image felt like failure. And failure, in his mind, meant weakness. So he froze. Stuck between who he was and who he pretended to be. Prayer became mechanical. Meditation became a task. The peace he once sought now felt distant, almost mocking. He asked himself why humility, something he thought he possessed, now felt so unreachable. Yet the more he tried to reclaim his old certainty, the more restless he became. Denial does not shout. It whispers. It tells you to hold on when it is time to release. It convinces you that stillness means strength, even when it is only fear in disguise. And so Tenzin remained suspended in that quiet struggle, unaware that healing was waiting just beyond the one thing he refused to do. Surrender. One misty morning, Tenzin found himself walking along the monastery's outer path, where the pine trees bent low under the weight of dew. His steps were automatic, his mind restless. He wanted to pray, but even that felt hollow. He wanted clarity, but clarity seemed a stranger. Ahead, he noticed a small figure tending the herb garden, a young novice named Jinpa, barely more than a boy, with hands caked in soil and a quiet smile that somehow felt fearless. Jinpa looked up and bowed. Tenzin nodded without speaking, unsure why he even wanted to engage. "You are troubled," Jinpa said simply. Tenzin blinked, startled by the directness. I have failed," he murmured. The boy shook his head. "You are not the first, nor the last, to fail. But failing is not the problem. Refusing to look at it is." Tenzin frowned. "I have served. I have worked harder than most. I thought I was humble. And now," his voice faltered. "Now I feel lost." Jinpa crouched and picked up a small stone, smoothing its edges with his fingers. "Humility," he said softly, "is not about being seen as good or wise. It is about being truthful, with yourself. You do not need the eyes of others to prove it. You only need to see clearly." The simplicity struck Tenzin like a bell. He realized he had been seeking approval, not peace. He had been measuring humility as a reward, not a practice. And all the while, it had quietly slipped through his fingers. The boy smiled again, a gentle understanding in his eyes. "Let go of what you think you should be. Begin with what you are. One step. One breath. One act of honesty. That is all the universe asks." Tenzin felt something shift, a tremor of acceptance, a quiet release. The walls he had built around himself, the ego that had hardened into denial, softened just enough to let in a sliver of light. For the first time in weeks, he did not rush to correct, prove, or justify. He listened. And in listening, he began to learn what he had refused to see. After his encounter with Jinpa, Tenzin returned to his daily routines, but everything felt different. The stone corridors, once rigid and orderly, now felt like a path to practice, not a stage for recognition. His steps were slower, not from fatigue, but from attention. Each movement became intentional, each breath conscious. He began with small acts. He carried water for the novices without a word, swept the temple floors quietly, and tended the garden alongside Jinpa. At first, these tasks felt insignificant. The old Tenzin would have considered them beneath him, a waste of time. Yet, in performing them without expectation, he discovered a subtle joy, one that did not require acknowledgement or praise. Meditation transformed, too. Instead of counting time or monitoring thoughts, he allowed himself to simply be. Sometimes, he failed to quiet his mind, but he no longer judged the failure. Sometimes, he became impatient, but he accepted it with gentleness. He was learning that healing is not a race, and humility is not a destination, it is a practice. Slowly, Tenzin noticed the walls inside him softening. The shame that had pressed on his chest no longer felt like punishment, it became a guide. He could admit mistakes without fear. He could apologize without losing strength. Discipline returned, but it had shed its rigidity, becoming a quiet companion rather than a master. Even the younger monks noticed the change. They were drawn not by his authority, but by the calm patience he now carried. Some sought guidance, not because he commanded it, but because they sensed his presence had become real, rooted in truth, not image. At night, as he sat alone under the stars, Tenzin realized something profound. Strength is not the absence of failure, nor the accumulation of respect. Strength is the willingness to face oneself honestly, to bend without breaking, to release ego in exchange for clarity. For the first time in months, he felt peace. Not loud. Not performative. Just steady. And in that stillness, a new journey quietly began. The morning sun rose over the monastery, spilling golden light across the stone walls and prayer flags. Tenzin stood at the edge of the courtyard, breathing slowly, noticing the warmth on his face and the faint scent of pine in the air. There was no rush, no expectation, only presence. The transformation within him had taken months, invisible to most but profound to him. The humility he had once believed he possessed as a badge of honor was no longer a concept to perform, it had become lived reality. He no longer sought the approval of elders, novices, or even himself. His focus had shifted to the simple act of being present, of serving where needed, and of walking gently through life. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried calm clarity rather than authority. The novices began to come to him not out of fear of correction, but for guidance grounded in understanding. When mistakes occurred, he offered patience rather than judgment. When doubts arose, he offered presence rather than answers. Tenzin spent hours in quiet work, sweeping the temple floors, tending the herb garden, arranging stones along the paths. These acts, once trivial, now held deep meaning. In them, he felt connection, to the monastery, to the earth, to the rhythm of life itself. Even meditation felt different. No longer a tool to prove his discipline, it became a place of surrender, a practice of letting go. Thoughts came and went, and he observed them without attachment. Strength was no longer measured by control, but by the ability to flow with life. And in the stillness, Tenzin realized that true purpose is inseparable from humility. Recognition, success, and status were fleeting shadows, what endured was peace, compassion, and the quiet courage to face each day with honesty. He smiled softly, feeling neither pride nor relief, only a steady sense of alignment. The fall, the denial, the shame, they had all been necessary, guiding him toward this dawn. As the first light touched the peaks of the surrounding mountains, Tenzin understood that life's deepest strength is quiet, soft, and enduring. He had become more than disciplined. He had become truly humble. And in that humility, he had found lasting power. Tenzin sat beneath the ancient cedar in the monastery courtyard, the wind rustling its needles softly. He had walked the long, quiet path from pride to humility, from certainty to acceptance. And now, he looked outward, not to measure himself against others, but to see the lessons life had quietly offered. 1. Humility is not weakness, it is the strength to face yourself honestly. 2. Failure is a teacher, not a punishment, it shows where growth is waiting. 3. Letting go of ego opens space for understanding, connection, and true peace. 4. Discipline. Without awareness can become rigidity, compassion and presence restore balance. 5. Healing begins in small steps, in acts done without expectation or applause. 6. Courage is quiet, it lives in the willingness to release control and accept truth. 7. Purpose is inseparable from humility, found not in recognition, but in being of service. 8. transformation takes patience, but when it arrives, it is lasting, steady, and gentle. The young monks moved quietly around him, tending fires, carrying water, and arranging the stones of the path. Tenzin no longer sought their admiration. He simply observed, grateful for the rhythm of shared life, aware that strength can exist in stillness, and wisdom in listening. He thought of the fall, of denial, and of the encounter that had shifted everything. He realized that life does not give lessons to punish us, it gives them to guide us, to illuminate what we have refused to see. And so he smiled softly, a smile not born of pride, but of understanding. For anyone listening, anyone watching, anyone seeking, let go of what you think you should be. Begin with who you are. Step gently, breathe deeply, and trust that the quiet path holds the most enduring power. The journey is yours. Walk it with humility, and you will find yourself, stronger than ever.